The bar on 135th was dim enough to forgive a man for believing he had finally disappeared. Smoke hung low, sweet with whiskey and cigarettes, blurring faces into shadows. The piano in the corner missed half its keys, but nobody complained. It wasn't the kind of place that asked questions. It was the kind of place people came to forget their own names. For 13 years, he had learned how to become invisible. New hair, new voice, new habits. Different streets, different women, different lies. He told himself the city had moved on. That whatever he'd done had been buried under louder sins, fresher blood. Tonight, for the first time in over a decade, he allowed himself to sit with his back to the room. Table 4. Not more than a wobbling circle of wood near the wall. But it felt like a throne. From here, he could see the door in the reflection of the mirror behind the bar without turning his head. He ordered a drink he used to love. He smiled when the glass touched his lips. That's when the noise changed. Not louder, quieter. A pause in the room's rhythm. The kind you don't hear with your ears, only with your nerves. Laughter thinned. The piano missed a note and didn't recover. Someone stopped shuffling cards. He felt it before he saw it. A presence, steady and unhurried, somewhere behind him. Not the frantic energy of a drunk, or the sloppy attention of a hustler. This was different. This was controlled. Measured. Like someone who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. The man at table 4 didn't turn around. His hand tightened around the glass. The whiskey tasted wrong now. Bitter. Metallic. He suddenly remembered every name he'd changed, every door he'd slipped through, every night he'd woken up convinced footsteps were following him. 13 years of running. And the city had finally caught up. Somewhere in the smoke, beyond his vision, Bumpy Johnson had entered the room, and he wasn't here for a drink. The pattern interrupts. The 13-year silence breaks. 13 years doesn't start in a bar. It starts in a back room where the air is too hot and the walls sweat secrets. The man at table 4 wasn't born a ghost. He was made one the night he picked the wrong side and thought it would be quick. Back then, Harlem was a chessboard dressed up like a neighborhood. Money moved through hands that never touched it. Respect moved faster than bullets. And Bumpy Johnson, quiet, tailored, eyes like a locked drawer, ran his corner of the world like a man who hated waste. He didn't yell. He didn't brag. He didn't need to. When Bumpy spoke, men leaned in like they were catching a prayer. The betrayer knew all of that. He'd sat close enough to smell Bumpy's cologne. Close enough to hear the calm in his voice when other men were shaking with ego. So when a rival offered him safety, cash, a new name, when they promised he could step out from under Bumpy's shadow, he convinced himself he was doing business. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was paperwork, whispers, a door left open at the wrong time. A route mentioned to the wrong ears. One meeting missed on purpose. The kind of treachery that lets a man tell himself it wasn't personal. Then it happened. The traps snapped, men got hurt, and Harlem streets started asking one question with every glance. Who set that up? The betrayer waited for the retaliation. He waited for the screaming, the boots on stairs, the sudden vanishing of friends. He waited for Bumpy to explode. But Bumpy didn't. No message. No warning. No public humiliation. No headline body. Nothing. The knowledge that somewhere, a patient man was counting, remembering, and smiling in the dark. That silence was the first cut. Weeks passed. The months. Then years. The betrayer ran anyway, because the absence of pursuit felt worse than pursuit. If Bumpy wasn't chasing, it meant he didn't need to. It meant he'd already done the math and decided time would finish the job cleaner than a gun. So the man rebuilt himself in the cracks of America. New city, new work, new smile. Yet every quiet room felt staged. Every friendly face felt rented. Because deep down he couldn't answer the question that kept him awake. What does Bumpy Johnson know that he hasn't said out loud yet? Bumpy's name didn't have to be spoken to be felt. In Harlem, power wasn't always the loudest man at the bar or the flashiest suit on Lenox. Power was the way a street went quiet when a certain car rolled past. Power was a bartender pretending not to notice a familiar face. Power was a cop deciding he suddenly didn't want to work that block tonight. Harlem in those years ran on agreements written in smoke. Italians own the headlines, families with downtown money, lawyers on retainer, and a talent for turning fear into rent. Their crews wanted Harlem the same way they wanted everything: measured, taxed, predictable. They didn't need love. They needed a system that paid. The cops helped. Not the uniform on the corner who still believed in rules, but the ones who understood what a badge could earn. They shook down numbers runners, lost evidence, and made sure raids landed where someone had already been paid to lose. If a man got arrested, it wasn't always because he was guilty. Sometimes it just meant his protection money went to the wrong pocket. Even the preachers played their part, praying on Sunday and negotiating on Monday, because salvation didn't keep the lights on in Harlem. And then there was Bumpy Johnson, quiet, disciplined, and dangerously local. He didn't pretend Harlem was a prize to be taken. Harlem was his home, and that made him different from the outsiders who treated it like a ledger. He understood which churches could calm a street, which barbershops carried the real news, which doormen saw everything. He knew when to squeeze and when to let a man breathe, because too much pressure makes people reckless. Bumpy's dominance wasn't built on chaos. It was built on an order that looked almost invisible if you didn't know where to look. A gambler paid on time and didn't get robbed. A store owner could refuse a thug because the thug knew there would be consequences. A fighter could walk out of a club with his winnings because the wrong kind of violence would bring the wrong kind of attention. In Bumpy's Harlem, randomness was expensive, and he hated expensive mistakes. That's what made the balance so fragile. Italians could muscle in with numbers, cops could lean harder with arrests, and Harlem's own young wolves could bite for a bigger share. Every faction watched every other faction like fingers hovering over triggers. One misread look, one unpaid debt, one public insult, and the whole structure could turn into a street war that burned money as fast as blood. Bumpy held it together because he could speak to all of them without begging. He could offer the Italians profit, the cops peace, and Harlem dignity, just enough of each to keep the gears turning. But deals like that don't break from emotion. They break from ambition. And in a city where ambition never sleeps, all it takes is one man deciding the quiet king is beatable. He told himself it was just money at first. A smart cut from a larger pie, a quiet skim that nobody would notice. In Harlem, everybody ate off somebody. Everybody bent the rules. So when he lifted a little from Bumpy's operation, he called it survival, not betrayal. But greed is never satisfied with being small. The real offer didn't come from a street punk. It came wrapped in downtown confidence, Italian suits, clean nails, and the kind of smile that said this was business, not danger. They didn't want his courage. They wanted his access. Names, routes, schedules. Who carried, who counted, who talked too much after midnight. They wanted the soft parts of Bumpy's machine, the people who trusted that the man above them had already handled the risk. And that's what he sold. Not numbers. Not product. Not a stack of bills you could replace by next week. He sold the map of living men. He told himself Bumpy would adapt. Bumpy was always adapting. Or maybe Bumpy was too busy fighting cops, fighting politicians, fighting the Italians themselves, too many fires to notice one leak. He even let himself believe the oldest lie of all, that time makes danger forgetful. That if Bumpy didn't strike immediately, it meant Bumpy couldn't. Arrogance loves silence. It uses it as proof. When no one came for him the first week, he smiled. When no one came the first month, he started sleeping again. When a year passed, he convinced himself the story had ended. Maybe Bumpy got clipped. Maybe Bumpy got caged. Maybe Bumpy got soft. But Harlem doesn't forgive men who gamble with other people's lives. Those men don't just break rules. They tear the fabric that keeps everyone from drowning. Because the information he sold didn't just cost money, it moved the police to the right doorway, on the right night, when the wrong person was holding the bag. It put Bumpy's runners in cages. It put loyal soldiers in hospitals. It put mothers on stoops waiting for sons who wouldn't come home. The betrayal traveled downhill, and every step it took, it got uglier. That was the fatal mistake. He thought he was stealing from a king. He was endangering a family. He didn't understand the difference between fear and respect. Fear scatters when the lights come on. Respect stays in the dark, waiting. Bumpy cultivated respect. So when the betrayal hit, He didn't rush. He let the betrayer breathe, build, believe, then tighten the circle until every exit looked wrong. Bumpy's power wasn't just territory. It was trust, men believing that if they stood under his flag, they wouldn't be sacrificed for someone else's ambition. So when that trust was punched full of holes, it demanded an answer. Not because Bumpy was emotional. Because the streets were watching, measuring, deciding whether his calm was control or weakness. And somewhere in that long, weaponized silence, Bumpy decided the correction would come with patience, so the lesson would last. Bumpy didn't react the way lesser men reacted, because reaction was a kind of surrender. Reaction meant the other guy set the tempo. Reaction meant the street could drag you by the collar into a mess you didn't choose. Bumpy Johnson hated being pulled. He preferred to stand still and let the world reveal itself around him. When word reached him, when the shape of the betrayal became clear, his face didn't change. No fist slammed a table. No threats flew across the room. He listened the way a judge listens, patient, cold, and already separating truth from noise. In his mind, emotion was a luxury for men who didn't have territory to defend. Loyalty wasn't a slogan to Bumpy. It was architecture. The only thing holding Harlem together when everybody else, Italians, cops, politicians, treated it like a market. A loyal man meant routes stayed clean. It meant money moved without panic. It meant young soldiers didn't have to prove themselves with stupid violence. And it meant the people beneath him could sleep, because the world made sense. Betrayal, to Bumpy, wasn't heartbreak. It was corrosion. You didn't ignore corrosion. You didn't throw a tantrum at it. You found where it started, how far it spread, and you cut it out without damaging the rest of the structure. That was the difference between Bumpy and the loud men who ruled by fear. Loud men needed noise to feel alive. Bumpy used silence the way other men used guns. He understood something the betrayer never did. Chasing is a form of attention. Chasing makes a man feel important. It turns him into a story. It gives him adrenaline, purpose, a reason to believe he's still in the game. Bumpy wouldn't grant that. If a man crossed him, Bumpy didn't want him feeling hunted. Bumpy wanted him feeling forgotten, until forgetting became unbearable. So he waited. Not lazily. Not passively. Waiting for Bumpy was work. It was gathering names without asking twice. It was watching who got nervous, who got rich too fast, who started drinking harder, who suddenly moved apartments. It was mapping relationships like streets, measuring who would fold under pressure and who would hold. He didn't need to interrogate everyone. He just needed time, because time makes people sloppy. Time makes them talk. Time makes them think the danger is gone. That's where the enemy's paranoia began, while Bumpy's mind stayed clear. The betrayer was out there, changing cities, changing faces, flinching at footsteps, searching every room for shadows. Meanwhile, Bumpy was calm enough to eat dinner, calm enough to smile at church ladies, calm enough to let Harlem believe he'd moved on. Because Bumpy knew the most frightening thing a man can feel isn't pursuit. It's certainty that the other man is not in a hurry. By the time Bumpy decided to move, the decision was already old in his head, polished smooth, stripped of impulse. The only question left wasn't whether the betrayer deserved it. Harlem had answered that. The question was what kind of ending would teach the cleanest lesson and leave the fewest loose ends. Bumpy didn't send a posse into the night with guns and a name. That would have been loud, and loud was the betrayer's oxygen. Instead, Bumpy built a trap the way Harlem built myths, slow, quietly, and in plain sight. Step 1 was rumor, but rumor with a leash. He let a few sentences slip in the places where words traveled fastest: barbershops, back rooms, church steps after Sunday service. Not, "We're looking for him." Not, "Bumpy wants blood." Just a softer poison. Bumpy had bigger problems now. Bumpy was tied up downtown. Bumpy was sick. Bumpy was distracted. Men repeated it because it sounded safe. The betrayer heard it because safety is what he hunted. Step 2 was false peace. Bumpy eased pressure on the edges. No flashy hits, no public tantrums, no sudden crackdowns. He made Harlem feel steady again. When a street feels stable, people start believing in tomorrow. And when people believe in tomorrow, they start reaching for extra. They gamble. They brag. They reappear. Step 3 was the ledger of ghosts. Bumpy pulled out old names like photos from a drawer. Drivers, runners, girlfriends, cousins, the man who once slept on a sofa during hard times. Not everyone was guilty. Most were simply connected. But connection is a wire, and Bumpy knew which ones still carried current. He didn't threaten them. Threats make men defensive. He paid old debts. He erased problems. A favor isn't a gift, it's a receipt. Step 4 was the decoy of opportunity. A new shipment was whispered about, an easy score, clean product, big margin, no Italians breathing down necks. The kind of opportunity that could change a man's life, the kind that makes caution feel like cowardice. It wasn't advertised. It was accidentally mentioned to the right ears, then denied, then mentioned again. The story took on heat because people wanted it to be true. Step 5 was patience with a clock hidden inside it. Bumpy didn't need the betrayer to show his face. He needed him to touch something, call someone, send a letter, ask a question. So Bumpy watched the watchers. He tailed the old associate who couldn't keep his mouth shut. He listened for the out-of-place phone call that came too late at night. He noticed the sudden visitor at a familiar address, the extra coat hung in a hallway, the taxi that circled twice before stopping. Each detail was a stitch. Step 6 was making the world feel smaller. The betrayer's old circles began to close without him noticing. A friend he trusted moved away. A cousin he relied on got spooked and stopped answering. A familiar bartender suddenly acted like a stranger. The betrayer would think it was bad luck, or age, or the city changing. He wouldn't realize he was being herded, like livestock, toward the one place he still believed he could rest, anonymity. Step 7 was the final gift, permission to relax. Bumpy allowed a story to bloom that the betrayal had been forgotten, that time had done what time does, that Harlem had swallowed the past. Because a man who's hunted learns to survive on tension. But a man who believes he's safe makes one mistake every time. He sits down. That was the plan. No running, no dramatic showdowns, no bullets wasted on a chase. Just a slow siege where the betrayer's own hunger for normal life did the heavy lifting. By the time he resurfaced, he wouldn't feel hunted. He'd feel lucky. And luck, in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, was just the moment the trap finally closes on him, softly, all at once. The first word came in like a match in a quiet room. Not shouted, not celebrated, delivered. A name Bumpy hadn't heard in years, tied to a bar, tied to a table, tied to a man who'd learned to live as smoke. The spotter didn't know the history. He didn't need to. Bumpy heard what mattered. The ghost had sat down, and ghosts only sit down when they think the war is over. Bumpy didn't move fast. He moved clean. He called for one car, one driver, one man who knew how to listen. In Harlem, urgency wasn't volume. It was precision. He left the whiskey untouched, eyes steady, mind measuring distance and time like weights in his palm. 72 hours. Maybe less. A man like that never stayed once the air changed. First meeting, a back office above a storefront, where the numbers added up, except now every number was a location. Bumpy spoke in short sentences. Who saw him? What did he wear? What did he order? Which hand held the glass? The smallest detail was a thread. Bumpy only needed one to pull. Second meeting, the old associate who used to run messages, now older, softer, still greedy. Bumpy didn't threaten him. He offered him something better, a chance to be useful again. The associate tried to laugh it off, tried to act like the past was dead. Bumpy let the silence sit between them until the man's throat tightened. Then the truth spilled. There'd been a phone call, a coded question, a familiar voice pretending it wasn't familiar. 12 hours gone. And the city kept its mouth shut. By nightfall, Harlem's map started shrinking. A bartender remembered the scar near the ear. A doorman recalled the nervous glance at the mirror. A cabbie described the neighborhood where the fare asked to be dropped early. Each account tightened the circle. Bumpy didn't chase the man. He chased the pattern. People who hide for 13 years don't change one thing. They leave the same way they arrive, carefully. Day 2, dawn. Bumpy walked his territory like it was a board he'd already solved. He sent one crew to watch train stations without looking like they were watching. Another to linger near bus depots, buying coffee, reading papers, counting faces. He had a man sit in the lobby of a cheap hotel for hours, doing nothing, because doing nothing made strangers forget you were there. 36 hours. Then the counter move. The betrayer felt the shift. Not a sighting, not a warning, just the city's temperature changing. A question asked twice. A stare held half a second too long. He'd start packing soon, cutting ties, disappearing into the cracks again. Bumpy knew the signs because he'd studied the fear that makes men run. 48 hours. A final address surfaced, whispered like a confession. A friend of a friend's room, a place used for one night and never again. Bumpy stared at it on paper as if it might blink. He didn't smile. He didn't rush. He simply stood, coat buttoned, and the men around him stopped breathing. Because now it wasn't patience. It was execution. And with only hours left before the ghost vanished, Bumpy stepped toward the door, uncertain whether he'd find a man waiting at table 4 or an empty chair still warm. The bar wore darkness like a suit. Smoke curled under low lamps, glasses clinking in slow rhythm while the piano limped through a song nobody bothered to name. At table 4 he sat like a man borrowing comfort. 1 drink. 1 hour. 1 small proof that 13 years of hiding had finally worked. He'd chosen the seat for its mirror, the door behind him, always visible without turning. He could leave in 10 seconds if the air changed. The air changed anyway. In the mirror, a shape appeared, steady, unhurried. The room didn't react with noise. It reacted with subtraction, laughter thinning, conversation stepping back, a bartender wiping the same spot twice. The betrayer's fingers tightened on his glass. He didn't turn. Turning would mean he'd been found. Then a voice, quiet enough to make him lean in. 13 years. He turned slowly, and Bumpy Johnson was there, coat buttoned, hat low, eyes calm and locked. No swagger. No heat. Just control that made the table feel like a courtroom. Bumpy took the chair across from him as if it had been reserved. Table 4 became its own world. The bar's noise returned at the edges, careful not to touch them. The betrayer tried to speak first, something light, something clever, but his mouth betrayed him. Only a dry swallow. Bumpy watched him, patient as stone. Then he placed a folded paper between them, worn at the crease. "What's that?" the betrayer asked. Silence answered first. Not empty silence, working silence. The kind that forces a man to confess with his breathing. Bumpy nodded toward the page. "Names," he said. "Places. Dates." The betrayer looked down and saw his own treachery written back at him. The route he'd whispered, the door he'd left open, the men who paid for it. The list was short. It didn't need to be long to be heavy. "I didn't mean." "You did," Bumpy said. "Certain. You meant enough." The betrayer reached for the paper, as if tearing it could erase the years. Bumpy's hand covered his, firm, not brutal, simply final. The message wasn't threat. It was ownership. That's when the truth hit. Bumpy hadn't failed to catch him. Bumpy had allowed him to live inside his own fear until fear became a cage. Around them, the piano held a wrong note too long. Someone clinked ice too loud, then stopped. Bumpy leaned in just a fraction. "You ran from me," he said. "That was your work. This is mine." He nodded once. A man from the shadows stepped close enough to block the betrayer's view of the door. No weapon showed. No scene erupted. Just the geometry of the room shifting against him. Bumpy rose, straightening his cuffs like the conversation was finished. He looked down at the betrayer as if checking a debt. "Finish your drink," Bumpy said. "It'll be your last calm one." The betrayer tried to stand. A hand on his shoulder kept him seated, gentle, unstoppable. His chest tightened, and for the first time in 13 years he understood what safety had been. A story he told himself. Bumpy walked to the exit without haste. At the threshold he paused, not to gloat, only to make sure the lesson landed. Outside, a car door opened once, then shut. No hurry. No argument. Just the city making room for consequence tonight. In Harlem, you could outrun bullets. You could outrun sirens. But you could not outrun a patient man who remembered. And at table 4, The silence ended the way it was always meant to end, not with chaos, but with control. By morning, nobody had to say what happened at Table 4. Harlem didn't need a headline to understand a shift in weather. The streets carried it the way they carried everything, quietly in fragments. A barber leaned in and lowered his voice. A bartender poured 2 extra fingers for a man who looked shaken. A numbers runner heard it from a cousin who heard it from a doorman who swore he saw Bumpy's hat disappear into the night like a closing door. The details changed with every retelling. That was the point. The truth wasn't in the specifics. The truth was in the certainty. The ghost had been found, and Bumpy Johnson had done it without raising his voice. That kind of ending travels faster than gunfire. The Italians heard it first through their own channels, and they didn't laugh. They respected one thing above all else: control. A loud war brings police, journalists, politicians hungry to look heroic. But a quiet correction? That's professional. That's the kind of discipline they pretended was theirs alone. They'd wanted Harlem to be predictable. Now they understood the prediction had a name. The cops heard it too. The wrong ones, the ones with soft pockets and hard faces. They didn't write reports. They adjusted. A patrol car took a different route. A raid got delayed. A detective decided a certain warrant could wait until next week. The message wasn't, "Don't come." The message was, "Know where you're stepping." Harlem didn't become safe. It became arranged. And the young wolves, the loud ones with hungry eyes, felt something worse than fear. They felt small. Because Bumpy had proven the streets weren't ruled by whoever could shout the most or shoot the quickest. They were ruled by whoever could hold a decision in their chest for 13 years and still execute it like it was scheduled. That kind of patience turns bravado into childish noise. It makes impulse look like weakness. Men who'd been flirting with disloyalty suddenly remembered old principles. They paid debts early. They stopped talking in public. They returned calls they'd been dodging. In the underworld, morality is rarely about goodness. It's about survival. And survival requires a rulebook everyone believes in. That's what Bumpy restored. Not because he wanted to teach the city a sermon. Because a territory without loyalty collapses. A boss who can't protect his people becomes a target. And the moment that happens, Harlem doesn't just lose money, it loses order. Stores burn. Bodies stack. Outsiders pour in and start carving. The betrayal had threatened more than Bumpy's pride. It threatened the ecosystem. So when the consequence arrived, it didn't land like revenge. It landed like gravity. The man who hid for 13 years had chased freedom, and what he found was time. Time as a weapon, time as a debt collector, time refusing to forget. Harlem watched and understood. You don't buy your way out of betrayal. You rent peace, and the bill always comes due. That's the moral accounting nobody escapes. Respect is currency. Loyalty is insurance. And in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, the cost of choosing the wrong side isn't immediate. It's inevitable. After Table 4, Harlem didn't feel louder. It felt sharper. Like the city had been reminded of an old rule and decided to obey it again. People still hustled, still lied, still reached for more than they deserved, because that's what men do when money is close. But betrayal? Real betrayal? The kind that sells out the people under the same roof? That became rarer than mercy. Not because Bumpy Johnson turned Harlem into a church. Because he turned it into a place where consequences had a longer memory than desire. He didn't need to parade bodies or scream warnings into the street. He didn't need to make an example every week. The example had already been made, and it lived in the spaces between conversations, where men lowered their voices and chose their words like they mattered. Bumpy's legacy wasn't built on how fast he moved. It was built on how still he could be. Most bosses needed action to prove they were alive. They chased disrespect like dogs chasing headlights, always in motion, always reacting, always exhausted. Bumpy didn't chase. He watched. He waited. He let a man's own choices drag him back to the edge. That's what turned him into something bigger than a gangster. He became a kind of weather system. You didn't argue with it. You didn't insult it. You checked the sky and planned accordingly. Italians with their downtown connections understood it. Cops with their dirty deals respected it. And the loud young wolves learned it the hard way. The city doesn't belong to whoever makes the most noise. It belongs to whoever can control the silence. Because silence, in Bumpy's hands, wasn't absence. It was pressure. It was the slow tightening of a fist you couldn't see. It was a man feeling safe just long enough to make one mistake. It was a ghost learning he'd never been forgotten, only scheduled. That's why nobody wanted to be the next lesson. A man could survive a quick war. He could hide from a hot pursuit. He could outrun panic. But how do you run from patience? How do you defend yourself against a mind that doesn't need the moment, doesn't need the applause, doesn't need the satisfaction of immediate pain? You can't. And Harlem understood that. So years later, long after the whispers changed and new names climbed the blocks, Bumpy's method stayed in the air like smoke that never fully clears. Men told the story in different bars, on different corners, in different decades. They didn't always get the facts right. They didn't need to. The feeling was what mattered. The calm man at the center, the arrogant man thinking he'd escaped, the quiet ending that arrived exactly when it was supposed to. And that's the real lesson Bumpy left behind. Some men hunt you down. But some men don't hunt at all. They simply hold their ground so completely that the world bends back toward them, and sooner or later, you walk right into the place you swore you'd never return.